In 1896, Theodor Herzl published the pamphlet Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State, which argued that anti-Semitism was simply a fact of life that would never be removed from European societies. Because of this, Herzl said, the issue could only be solved by a Jewish exodus out of Europe and into a land of their own. This concept became known as Zionism. At the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, Herzl established the Zionist organization. He would go on to write in his diary, "In Basel, I created the Jewish state." In reality, he had laid the groundwork for the next step towards its creation, which occurred in 1917 during the First World War. Throughout the early 20th century, Zionism had grown popular among influential European Jewish bankers and intellectuals. Many of these powerful figures lived in Britain and assisted in the funding of the British war effort when the First World War broke out. During the war, Britain issued a formal statement viewing, quote, with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Palestine, which after the war would become a British mandate, was around the time of the Balfour Declaration partially controlled by the British-occupied Enemy Territory Administration, after it had been captured from the Ottoman Empire, who had controlled it since 1516 AD. The reason the British chose Palestine was partially religious and partially strategic. Biblically, the region was home to the Hebrew tribes, or the Israelites, who eventually consolidated into the Kingdom of Israel and split into the northern Kingdom of Israel and the southern Kingdom of Judah, whose descendants would later be known as Jews. These Hebrew kingdoms were conquered by various ancient empires, including the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and many were scattered across the Mediterranean to different regions like Greece, Anatolia, and Carthage. Eventually, however, the Romans conquered the Levant, and after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD, Emperor Hadrian renamed the Roman province of Judea to Syria Palestina, or Palestine. So the Zionist project had an ancient mythos to tie itself to, but the real underlying reason for the Balfour Declaration was strategic. Britain wanted to enlist Jewish support for the Entente war effort. Their enemies, the Central Powers, particularly Germany and the Ottoman Empire, had large Jewish populations that Britain saw as a fifth column to be exploited. Simultaneously, if Britain could establish a population in the region which was beholden to the British Empire, this would secure a strategic buffer near the Suez Canal in Egypt, which was a major chokehold on the sea route to the jewel of the empire, British India, the safeguarding of which effectively all of Britain's imperial policy revolved around. However, the declaration also included the provision that, quote, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. It also ran against several of Britain's commitments to the Arab nationalists they had assisted in overthrowing Ottoman Turkish control of much of the Middle East. Whereas Britain had previously promised to support several independent Arab kingdoms and states, the new British and French mandates in the region, established by the League of Nations, in conjunction with Britain's promises to the Zionists, alarmed the Arab populations of the Levant. As National Socialism rose in Germany, large numbers of Jewish immigrants left Europe for Palestine. Zionist organizations began to purchase land and establish agricultural settlements and even settler towns. The Palestinian Arabs had a great disdain for this mass immigration, leading to violent clashes in Jerusalem and across the region throughout the 1920s, especially as land disputes grew into full-fledged conflicts over control of the holy sites. Then, in 1936, Palestinian Arabs staged a massive general strike, which turned into an uprising against British rule. This new Arab revolt was severely suppressed by the British, and the Palestinian Arab leadership were heavily scattered and fragmented as a result. But the British understood something needed to be done to prevent the situation from escalating again, and thus Britain altered its policy and issued the 1939 White Paper, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine and limited land sales to Jews, aiming to cap the Jewish population and eventually transition Palestine into an independent, shared state between the Arabs and a significant Jewish minority. This reversal deeply alienated the Zionist movement, who now believed Britain could not be trusted to be their continued benefactor, and simultaneously failed to appease all segments of the Arab leadership. By the end of the Second World War, however, the atrocities of the Holocaust were revealed to the world. Faced with this terror and the sheer physical annihilation of the war, There was a great deal of moral and political pressure for a Jewish state, which became overwhelming. By 1947, an exhausted and bankrupt Britain turned the Palestine problem over to the United Nations. The UN Special Committee on Palestine recommended partitioning the territory into independent Arab and Jewish states. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly passed Resolution 181, which called for the partition, a plan accepted by the Zionists, but rejected by the Arab leadership. But now the United States and Soviet Union took up the roles of the superpower backers of the Zionist cause. President Truman supported the UN partition plan and led the United States to an early recognition of the newly established State of Israel, for both humanitarian reasons stemming from the American reaction to the Holocaust and domestic political concerns regarding the loyalty of the Jewish vote. Truman was actually warned by the State Department that such support would jeopardize American oil interests and alienate the Arabs, with whom America had cultivated close ties during the war, in particular the Saudis. However, Truman ignored the State Department and pushed forward regardless. The Soviet Union under Stalin also backed the State of Israel. Stalin was an enthusiastic supporter of the Zionist project, viewing a Jewish state as a tactical tool to weaken British influence in the Middle East. Stalin even authorized massive military assistance to the Zionists through the country of Czechoslovakia during the critical early months of its establishment in 1948. The Soviet Union had a massive Jewish population, which Stalin believed could be used as a tool since many were moving to Israel. He also believed that Israel was ripe ground for a communist revolution. The leadership of the early State of Israel, such as the first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, were heavily aligned with the labor movement and democratic socialism. Jewish settlements in the region were also communal, mostly operating under the kibbutzim collective farming model, and in Stalin's view, this mirrored the Marxist ideals of collective property. He and other Soviet officials were thus led to believe that Israel was naturally trending toward communism. During that critical period wherein Stalin provided military support to the Israelis, Israel was directly fighting Britain for its independence. The war was relatively short, and on May 14, 1948, as the last British troops departed, David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv. The proclamation asserted that the State of Israel was the historic birthplace of the Jewish people and would be open to the, quote, ingathering of Jews from all countries of their dispersion. Immediately upon its declaration, Israel was attacked by the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Despite being outnumbered, the Israelis won with Soviet weaponry, and thus, by the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel held 21% more land than the UN partition plan had originally allocated it. For the Palestinians, this period became known as Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe, resulting in the expulsion or fleeing of approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs. Most became refugees in the West Bank, Gaza, and other neighboring Arab states like the Kingdom of Jordan. Simultaneously, the war compelled anywhere between 400,000 to as many as 800,000 Jews to flee out of Muslim lands, such as Yemen and Iraq, between 1948 and 1957, most of whom found asylum in the new Israeli state. Israel enacted the absentee property regulations that transferred the houses, land, and businesses of Palestinians who had fled into the possession of the new state, providing them to these new Jewish immigrants. All of this completely changed the face of the Middle East. It led to various proxy conflicts throughout the Cold War, created refugee crises, and deep ethnic and political grievances, issues which very clearly still affect the Middle East and the world to this day. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the State of Israel was never established? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers in 2026, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our generous channel members. Thank you, and enjoy the video. The main issue with this scenario is that not all of the structural vectors that led to the creation of the State of Israel are necessarily preventable. The ideological conditions that produced Zionism were, as Theodor Herzl pointed out, ingrained features of 19th century European civilization. Similarly, the Holocaust and the political and demographic pressure it created cannot simply be undone without completely altering the context in which all of modern history occurred. What can be changed, however, are the specific decisions of powerful governments throughout the early 20th century. Our first and most foundational change will concern Britain. As we mentioned, in 1939, Britain issued the White Paper to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine, but the White Paper was on the ground basically a half measure, undermined by the conflict in the Levant and by Zionist paramilitary resistance that would later chip away at Britain's willingness to govern the region in their exhausted post-war state. But if we suppose that instead, the British treat the White Paper as an important commitment, this would change the Palestinian question as the Second World War winds down. Specifically, we will assume that in 1944, Churchill's government, which was aware that the war was nearing its end and that the Palestinian question would soon demand a resolution, convened an international conference and formally codified a transition toward a unitary Palestinian state, built upon the precedent of the White Paper, but with constitutionally guaranteed minority protections for the Jewish population and a defined timeline for independence. This was floated in concept already. Binational agreements and solutions involving the Commonwealth had actively been discussed within both Zionist and British circles as late as 1940. The effect of such a move, though, would have been to sidestep the United Nations partition question entirely, establishing a legal settlement before the United Nations is even created. Equally important, such a commitment, which would have been made before the Palestinian Arab leadership was entirely scattered, would have given the moderate Arab political figures who survived the suppression of the 1936 revolt a political victory around which to consolidate. Palestinian politics were crippled by a bitter clan rivalry between the moderate Nashashibi family and the hardline Husseini family. The British had spent the late 1930s exiling and crushing the Husseinis, but the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, still held massive sway from abroad. So even though the moderates now would have something to defend through negotiation, they would have very high-profile populist opposition, which is still very dangerous. In this era, moderate Arab politicians who compromised with imperial powers, like the British, were frequently assassinated, like King Abdullah I of Jordan in 1951. Still, with this change, we have created a Palestinian state in name and somewhat in form, and for the exhausted British, that could do. Now for our next change, we must remove Soviet support for the Zionist project entirely. Without a two-state model, this is fairly easy, as now, even if he wanted to, Stalin would have to support Zionist militias and not an organized polity. We also know that Soviet intelligence had deeply penetrated Zionist networks, and what those networks revealed on close inspection by the early 1950s was that the Zionist project was not necessarily a proto-communist one, but rather was sustained by American Jewish capital and intertwined with Western diplomatic and financial circles. The dominant Zionist leadership, particularly the American connections of Chaim Weizmann and the financial infrastructure underpinning the Jewish Agency, the largest Jewish nonprofit in the world, would have looked to a perhaps more suspicious Soviet intelligence apparatus, a lot more like a Western intelligence project, which could thus dissuade Stalin from sending weapons to the Zionists in Palestine. So for the sake of our scenario, rather than backing the Zionist project as a tool against Britain, he would instead conclude that Arab nationalism, specifically the secular anti-colonial variety gaining momentum across Egypt and Iraq, would be the more reliable instrument for dislodging Western imperial influence from the region. This was, after all, the position the Soviet Union eventually adopted regardless. It simply would manifest earlier in this timeline. This, of course, also means that the critical supply of tanks, planes, and artillery, which was essential for the Zionist military victory of 1948, are never sent. And finally, our third change would be also to make President Truman heed the warnings of his own State Department. The diplomats and strategists who opposed him correctly predicted that the decision to support Israel would damage American oil interests and alienate the Arab world. Truman again overrode them because of the sheer weight of the uncovered Holocaust and the domestic political pressure to keep the Jewish vote. But of course, without a viable international partition plan to champion, Truman would effectively have nothing to support, and he would be much more inclined to heed the warnings of the State Department against taking moves to alienate the Arab countries. What may happen instead, in fact, is that Truman opens up the United States to greater Jewish immigration in the wake of the displaced population crisis. Again, he still has concerns about the after effects of the Holocaust. There were a few legislative proposals for a move like that in our own history, but they were consistently defeated by immigration restrictionists in Congress. A Truman who cannot lean on the partition plan as his answer to the crisis does have slightly more incentive to spend his political capital getting one of those proposals through instead. It might not actually pass, or whatever does pass might not mitigate the crisis as well, leaving Europe with a serious demographic crisis to continue to deal with and a large displaced Jewish population, but it also partially diffuses the most emotionally powerful argument for the Zionists, that being that there was literally nowhere else for the survivors of the Holocaust to go. Anyway, these three alterations effectively prevent the partition from ever occurring, and provide the great powers after the war with a legal framework to point to as the existing and internationally agreed upon solution. The Palestinian state that would be created would be an Arab one, with international interest in guaranteeing rights for the Jewish minority. It would be a state that would not see massive waves of Jewish migration in and other migration out of it, nor would it become embroiled in a war of independence, as its independence was already guaranteed by the British. This Arab state will still face a huge issue, however. By 1947, Zionist paramilitary groups like the Haganah and the Irgun were quite powerful organizations. International non-recognition of an Israel or any other Jewish state for them to organize around, along with the denial of Soviet arms, would severely constrain them, but would not dissolve them. And the history of the period shows us that the Zionist paramilitary leadership was willing to fight anyone, including Britain directly, as they had been doing since at least 1944 in order to defend their own interests. In this scenario, either the British military or this Arab Palestine must find a way to crack down on these organizations. If the British do this earlier and more decisively, especially with a less hostile Arab population, then British forces are not stretched fighting on two fronts and could likely campaign harder against the paramilitaries. However, Britain was, as we know, functionally bankrupt and had really no troops to spare. By 1946, the Haganah alone could mobilize around 50,000 armed, trained fighters, many of whom were veterans of the British military's Jewish Brigade from the Second World War. They were a highly disciplined, modern army in waiting, and thus, if the British even tried to enforce the creation of this new Palestinian state, they would have to deploy forces in massive quantities that simply aren't realistic. The Zionist militias also already operated extensive, highly sophisticated underground munitions factories, and were mass-producing submachine guns, mortar shells, and millions of rounds of ammunition right under the noses of the British. So even without Soviet arms, which is a crippling blow to their ability to fight in a proper heavy arms war, these groups will still possess a massive infantry advantage over any local Palestinian force, which means they can defend any territory they currently control. And of course, in practice, the British will simply be unprepared to defend this arrangement they've built. Britain was looking for a quick exit from the Levant and the Middle East, and a way to end their guerrilla war with these various paramilitary organizations. In July of 1946, the Irgun, one such Zionist paramilitary, would go on to bomb the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. By 1946, the Haganah's army would be launching continual attacks on British forces, and in late 1946, the British would thus begin the process of completely handing over the administrative authority to this new constitutional framework, convening the Palestinian Arab political leadership, and essentially just telling them to form a provisional government capable of receiving the handover. This process would, of course, be very unclean, plagued by political gridlock, but the British would likely have already set a date of exit sometime in 1947 or 1948, and really, like the partition of India, just wouldn't care about the outcome. They would care about getting their troops out. Without the United Nations vote providing a fixed political horizon around which both sides could organize, the violence in Palestine throughout these years would be constant and take on the character of a slow unraveling. Jewish paramilitary groups, again, who continued to attack British infrastructure and personnel, and the Haganah in particular, who tended to operate with incredible strategic discipline, would focus their energy on consolidating control over the coastal plain, which was a stretch of densely populated Jewish-controlled territory running from Haifa in the north and perhaps as far south as Tel Aviv and toward Jaffa. The more inland settlements would be more difficult to defend and supply, and thus the Haganah leadership, while not formally abandoning them, would move most of their best trained units and weapons into the coastal cities. By the time the British actually do leave, the state they would leave behind, this Palestine, would basically exist as a set of documents with contested legitimacy outlining a territory that is already functionally divided between zones of different paramilitary and guerrilla control along the coast and an Arab-majority highland in the interior. The moment the last British troops withdraw, the violence would essentially turn into a war. In the cities along the coast, Haganah forces would move quickly and ruthlessly to consolidate a border, brutally expelling or driving out or even killing the Arab populations, who would flow inland and into the highlands. The provisional Palestinian government would not have any organized military force and would thus collapse almost immediately as a functioning administrative state. At this point, the neighboring Arab states would also intervene, and it's important to understand that their intervention would not be coordinated, nor necessarily an act of solidarity with the Palestinians. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon each would send their militaries to enter Palestine with their own objectives and ambitions. The Arab states tended to be highly mutually suspicious, with rivalries amongst themselves that the state of Israel exploited in our own history. King Abdullah I of Jordan had the clearest goal. Abdullah explicitly stated that he did not want an independent Palestinian state. He wanted Palestine, or at least the Arab portions of it, absorbed into a Hashemite kingdom under his own crown. The Arab Legion, Jordan's military, was also the most capable fighting force in the region by a considerable margin. It was British-funded, British-equipped, and commanded by the British officer John Bagot Glubb, known universally as Glubb Pasha, whose tactical judgment was reliable and who had an instinct for controlled, limited operations rather than open-ended campaigns, the kind of campaigns that tend to get power stuck in the Middle East. The Jordanians could thus likely move all the way into Jerusalem and the West Bank highlands and come to control these territories. Egypt and Syria, though, were both fearful of the Jordanians. Egypt did not want a Hashemite kingdom on its northeastern border any more than they wanted a Jewish state there, and thus the Egyptians would likewise intervene. The Egyptian intervention, however, would not be against this new Jewish Haganah enclave on the coast, but into the interior of Palestine to secure control over the region from the Sinai into the Negev and Gaza Strip, occupying the south and establishing a buffer that can prevent Jordan from reaching the Mediterranean coast. Syria would also send forces into the Galilee, likewise to block Jordanian expansion northward, and to establish a Syrian claim to a share of whatever settlement eventually emerges. The Iraqi Expeditionary Force, who were the least well-organized of the interventions, would deploy into the northern West Bank and would essentially function primarily as a demonstration of pan-Arab solidarity for the domestic politics back in Iraq itself. What these armies would discover as they turn toward the coast, however, is that they're likely not going to win there. The Haganah's defensive perimeter around the Haifa corridor would be this fortified urban labyrinth, and the armies of 1948 simply were not built for that kind of fight. These Arab armies were defensive ones, and the combined initial strength of the Arab intervention would total somewhere between 20 and 25,000 men. These forces were trained as peacekeepers and border patrols, and really could not fight an offensive war, especially against these densely populated cities defended by 50,000 trained fighters who have nowhere to retreat and nothing to lose. I think the Egyptian army would make a drive, but stall in the open country south of Tel Aviv and take serious casualties attempting to destroy the outlying Jewish settlements. The Jordanians likely wouldn't engage the Jewish paramilitaries at all, leaving the situation to stall into a de facto ceasefire. The Jordanians, again, didn't like to take risks, and would already be satisfied in their conquest of Palestinian territory. The Haganah would thus hold an enclave in the coastal plain, while Jordan controls Jerusalem and the West Bank, and Egypt holds Gaza and Sinai. The Palestinian Arab population would now be caught between these competing occupations, divided between Jordan and Egypt, and just as quickly as it had been established, the provisional Palestinian state would be erased from the map. But that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't Israel. The Haganah enclave is not a recognized state. It does not have the capacity to influence international politics in the same way Israel historically would in the coming decades. Sure, it controls a coastline with a major port, and possesses the most battle-hardened, sophisticated fighting force in the region, but without recognition, they're stuck in political limbo, unable to truly use these resources to their fullest potential, like a Somaliland sort of situation. With the deep-water port in Haifa, they can certainly receive military and civilian shipments organized independently and covertly by the Jewish diaspora networks in the United States, France, and South Africa, who did, in our own history, supply various Jewish paramilitaries with money, machine tools, volunteer fighters, raw materials, food, and weapons. And the Haganah cannot necessarily be starved out with control of this port. Nor can the Arab navies, at least in their current forms, blockade or destroy their access to the sea. So this enclave effectively cannot be conquered at an acceptable cost, but it would persist unrecognized, not unlike the Palestine of our own world, as a fortified question mark on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Without a clear and safe, legitimate country, there would never be this influx of Jewish settlers and refugees to grow the population. Thus, it cannot grow anywhere close to the demographic size of the historical state of Israel, and would have to rely on technology and logistics to maintain a qualitative edge over its neighbors. Without the legal status of a sovereign port, this enclave would also likely face the same interdiction of trade and fuel that plagued Israel again in our own history, but here it would occur without significant Western protections. They would be starved for oil, which means a likely turn to the black market or other rogue states. The carve-up of Palestine would also more publicly shatter the facade of Arab unity. The Arabs were never really united, as we've outlined, but the broader world wasn't as tuned into this. However, here, that facade has completely fallen apart, and this will likely trigger a broader regional power structure. Egypt and the Saudis and the Syrians would be fearing a Hashemite or Jordanian conspiracy backed by Britain. The Soviet Union, as we mentioned, would also pivot entirely towards supporting radical Arab nationalism, which would accelerate the flow of Soviet weaponry into Syria and Egypt. In addition, eventually, the United Nations and the broader Western powers will want a formula to stabilize this de facto ceasefire. The United States would likely push for a trusteeship scheme. This could have involved the Jewish enclave accepting a sort of autonomous status within a Jordanian-led federation, that is to say, a republic within a kingdom, as King Abdullah had historically proposed. However, even a non-sovereign enclave would be viewed by the broader Arab world as a rogue crusader state to eventually be destroyed, especially considering the edge it could give the Jordanians if Jordan is able to utilize the port on the Mediterranean. I don't see this model truly being implemented, as, if it were, war would immediately break out between Jordan and the other Arab states, Egypt and Syria in particular, though perhaps also Lebanon and the Saudis, who would all refuse any settlement that either elevated the Jordanians or validated even a limited Zionist bridgehead. Now, in our own history, King Abdullah of Jordan was assassinated in July 1951 at the Al-Aqsa Mosque by a Palestinian gunman connected to the Husseini faction, shot because of rumors of his secret negotiations with Israel. In this timeline, he has an even bigger target on his back, especially because, from a certain perspective, he has allowed the Zionist coastal enclave to survive. He's taken Jerusalem for himself, while Palestinian refugees crowd into his newly expanded kingdom, likely bringing with them a deep resentment of the Hashemites. It is thus highly likely, that he is still assassinated in this timeline, perhaps even earlier. The teenage King Hussein of Jordan, who inherits the throne, will now inherit a kingdom doubled in size, with a Palestinian refugee population waning British support and neighbors who are eager to cripple his kingdom. Nasser would simultaneously be rising in Egypt in 1952 through the Free Officers' coup. The forces which drove that revolution, corruption, continued British presence in the Suez Canal zone, and the ambitions of the military officers haven't really changed in this scenario. But what has changed, though, is the direction Nasser's pan-Arab project would point once he consolidates power. In our own history, Israel was a common enemy around which the Arab world could theoretically unite, and against whose continued existence Nasser could define Egyptian leadership of the Arab nation. In this timeline, where the Jewish coastal enclave can serve some of the same rhetorical function, it is a considerably less useful one. It's unrecognized, it's technically militarily stalemated, and it's definitely not receiving American F-16s and bilateral security guarantees. Instead, the Pan-Arab project would be built around the Hashemite question. Jordanian control of Jerusalem and the West Bank is unacceptable and humiliating, and thus Jordan would replace Israel as the natural enemy of Nasserism and Pan-Arabism. The Soviet Union would also be eager to weaken British influence in the region, which runs through Jordan, and thus the Soviets would supply Egypt and Syria with military equipment and technical advisors from the early 1950s onward. When Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal in 1956, which triggered the Suez Crisis in our own history, things will be slightly different. It was historically Britain, France, and Israel who launched a coordinated tripartite invasion, with Israel providing the military pretext. Without an Israeli state to serve that function, Britain and France may still attempt some form of military action to reverse the nationalization, but likely could not put up the forces to do so, and thus would suffer an even more humiliating political embarrassment. In our own history, both America and the Soviet Union opposed the intervention of Britain, France, and Israel, and this signaled the end of the old imperial powers' dominance over geopolitics and the beginning of the two superpower dynamic of the Cold War. In this timeline, whatever Britain and France do will still face the same fury from American President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the humiliation would of course fall exclusively on Britain and France, without Israel existing as a complicating factor. The Pan-Arab project would still run into complications, however. The 1958 merger of Egypt and Syria into the United Arab Republic would still occur and then collapse by 1961. The Iraqi Revolution of 1958, which overthrew the Hashemite monarchy in Baghdad in an extraordinarily violent coup that killed the royal family and dragged the body of the pro-British Prime Minister Nouri al-Said through the streets, likewise would still occur, though it carries an additional significance here because it eliminates the Iraqi branch of the Hashemite dynasty and isolates King Hussein's Jordan as the sole surviving Hashemite state, surrounded by Arab republics. But there would be no Six-Day War. The low-intensity conflict in the Levant would simply continue throughout this time period. Egypt and Syria would face off against the Haganah and Jordan. Independent Palestinian armed factions would launch raids from Gaza under Egyptian patronage, and from the refugee camps of the West Bank under conditions that neither Jordan nor Egypt would really be able to control. The Haganah would not expand, but would not contract either, at least territorially. It would simply continue to exist as a military state benefiting from illicit Mediterranean trade, likely with significant portions of its civilian Jewish population fleeing for Europe or the United States. The demographics of this Middle East will become increasingly less Jewish, and the Palestinian political identity that comes from this would actually be more immediately focused on the Arab states that occupy Palestinian territory than on the Zionist enclave that originally displaced much of the population. Jordanian rule will never be popular, and we will continue to see violence in Jordanian Palestine likely into the late 1960s and through the 1970s. The Egyptian administration in Gaza would also probably be much harsher and more cynical, treating the region as a strategic buffer and its population as a demographic problem. But however popular Palestinian nationalism becomes, it still won't have the legitimate power to assert itself in the form of an independent state, at least not right now. The United States, for one, having maintained better relations with the Arabs by sidestepping the Israeli question, would still have to deal with complicated Middle Eastern politics, even without Israel as a target on their back. American oil interests in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Gulf states would be their main guiding principle now. The Saudis' persistent hostility to Arab nationalism, Nasserism, and Soviet influence would also give the Americans a sufficiently strong partner to work with, along with the Pahlavis in Iran. But American influence would be much less anchored. Without the militarily reinforced relationship with Israel, American engagement with the Middle East is more transactional, which simultaneously gives America less sway in the political revolutions and goings-on of the region, but also prevents it from being tied down in major conflicts, committing troops and planes that historically caused the erosion of America's position on the world stage, and their perception in the Middle East. It is highly likely that we simply don't see American intervention on the ground in the Middle East at all, which is a major departure from our own history. Now, the Iranian Revolution, if it still occurs here, would be a big blow to American soft power in the region, but also could be a bit more of a tool here as well. Again, American relationships in the Middle East are simply more transactional. Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic was not friendly to America whatsoever, but it also introduces a theocratic revolutionary ideology that simultaneously challenges the secular Arab nationalist model that the Soviets have been sponsoring. Without an Israel for the Iranians to target, Iran is not seen as such an evil boogeyman by the Americans, and for American policymakers it is again another tool in the tool belt to be used to further erode Soviet influence in the region. So, what the Middle East of this timeline ultimately resembles, by at least the 1980s, is a region that has traded one form of irresolvable conflict for kind of another. The Palestinian people are still stateless, divided now between Jordanian occupation, Egyptian administration, refugee camps, and the diaspora. The Haganah enclave will still sort of exist, and might either develop into a Mediterranean Taiwan of sorts, or will eventually be overrun, but it will never have the same sort of international power that the Israel of our world holds, especially today. It will be an isolated anomaly. And the Arab states are, of course, still fractured, still fighting proxy wars, and still rotating between American and Soviet patronage, depending on the moment. And the Cold War still runs through the region, like a huge fault line. So none of the fundamental grievances, or competition between ethnic and religious communities for the same small territories have necessarily been resolved. They have simply arranged themselves differently. History has changed, but human nature has not. But that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. If you want to watch a similar video on a more contemporary analysis of Israel and its relationship with the wider world, go check out What Comes After the US-Israeli Alliance by Monsieur Z, which looks at the implications of a modern-day split between America and Israel. And as always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.